Okay, we couldn't get our Zoom working tonight, so I'm just going to record this and send the video out to everyone. It's going to be Job 20 through 28, chapters 20 through 28. We go through a summary of each chapter at a time. And the summary of that I chose to look at, and it says, if you look at the world, you'll be distressed. If you look within, you'll be depressed. If you look at God, you'll be at rest. And she went through tough times, Corey Timboom, and what Job's friends are trying to do, and we're going to get rid of them tonight. But they're trying to get him to look within, and then he'll just be distressed. But he gets looking at them, and he gets distressed, and they should be helping him to get looking at the Lord. And as we see tonight, he's going to start looking more and more to the Lord. And finally, at the end of the book, which we'll get into in 2 weeks, is he's going to be face to face with the Lord. In Job 20, Zophar the Naamite delivers his second and final speech, which is a fierce and graphic denunciation of the wicked man provoked by Job's warning of divine judgment in the previous chapter. Zophar argues that while the wicked may prosper temporarily, their ruin is swift, certain, and brutal. So he said Job was evil, and then Job says, "No, you're the evil one." Now he's going to give his backlash here. Zophar's discourse follows a rigid, retributive theology, asserting that suffering is always a direct consequence of sin. That's kind of just the way the pagans, and we know sometimes suffering can be from God, sometimes for discipline, sometimes just to teach us a lesson. And he's kind of the pagan retributive type thing. In the agitated response, verse 1 through 3, Zophar begins by admitting his anxious thoughts and inward turmoil. He feels insulted by Job's previous rebukes and claims his spirit of understanding compels him to answer, which he thinks he's smarter than Job. The fleeting triumph of evil, verses 4 through 11, he appeals to the ancient traditions, stating that it has been known since man was placed on the earth that the joy of the hypocrite is only for a moment. Even if a wicked man's head reaches to the clouds, he will eventually perish like his own refused and vanquished like a dream. Most biblical commentaries note that Zophar's general principle that evil ultimately fails is true in a broad sense. His application to Job is cruel and incorrect. Misapplication of truth. Commentators like Matthew Henry point out that Zophar's biggest flaw was assuming God never varies from this intermediate retributive method. Presumption without compassion. Zophar's speech is often cited as a warning against knowledge without love, as he ignores Job's specific pain to defend a rigid theological system. His application to Job is cruel and incorrect. He should be getting him to look to the Lord, and he just doesn't have the love. Satanic undertones. Some modern studies suggest Zophar's relentless focus on doom and refusal to offer a path to repentance makes his speech satanic and lack of grace. Here's a verse from the chapter. So my anxious thoughts compelled me to answer because of the turmoil within me. So he's having problems inside his own soul too, and he's not looking to the Lord. Job 21, Job delivers a powerful rebuttal to his friends, dismantling their retributive theology and the beliefs that God always punishes the wicked and rewards the righteous in this life. That's karma thinking. This chapter marks a significant pivot as Job moves from defending his innocence to directly attacking the flaws in his friend's logic by pointing to the observed reality that the wicked often live long and prosperous lives. Key sections of Job 21, plea for a hearing. 1 through 6, Job asks his friends to listen carefully, suggesting that their silence would be a better consolation than their empty words. He admits that he is terrified by the implication of what he is about to say as it challenges traditional ideas of divine justice. So they're getting some new ideas. The prosperity of the wicked, 7 through 16, Job asks why the wicked live, grow old, and even increase in power. He notes that their children are established, their homes are safe from fear, and their livestock multiply without issue, despite openly rejecting God, saying, "Depart from us." They often spend their days in wealth and go down to the grave in peace. So not all wicked people have bad things happen, is what he's trying to say. Rejection of generational punishment. Job's friends argue that if a wicked man isn't punished, his children will be, and Job rejects this, arguing that the sinner should face the consequences himself. He points out that a selfish dead man does not care what happens to his descendants. And so this is individual responsibility, which is biblical. Death as the great leveler, 22 through 26. Job acknowledges that God is all wise and judges even the highest beings. However, he observes that one man dies in full strength and comfort while another dies in bitterness, yet both end up in dust where worms cover them. And he's not thinking real good here about the afterlife, which he has before. He's just kind of depressed right now. Confronting falsehood, 27 through 34. Job knows his friends are using their theories to label him as wicked. He urges them to ask travelers who can confirm that the wicked are often spared in times of calamity and receive honorable public funerals. He concludes that their attempts to comfort him are vain and full of falsehood because they ignore reality. And he's right. Theological and practical implications. Refuting retribution theology, Job proves that earthly prosperity is not a definite sign of God's favor, nor is its suffering always a sign of sin. The complexity of justice, the chapter highlights that God's justice operates on a timeline often beyond human understanding, frequently extending into the afterlife. Honesty before God. Job's willingness to voice his confusion and frustration is presented by many commentators as a model for bringing honest struggles before God. So he's being honest before God. And here's a quote, 21:22. Can anyone teach knowledge to God, since he judges those on high? So he's a higher judge and he judges higher people, and so God is above all knowledge. 22 contains the third and final speech of Eliphaz the Temanite, marking a turning point in the dialogue where he shifts from subtle hints to direct, harsh accusations against Job. The chapter allows a specific progression. It begins with a theological argument that human righteousness does not benefit God, moves into a series of unverified charges of social justice against Job, and concludes with a call for Job to repent to restore his fortunes. Key themes and structure. The unprofitableness of man, 1 through 4. Eliphaz argues that God is a self-sufficient and gains nothing from human righteousness. He uses this to suggest that God would not punish Job for being pious, so the punishment must be for sin. Direct accusation of the wickedness, 5 through 11. For the first time, Eliphaz lists specific infinite iniquities he assumes Job has committed, such as taking pledges from brothers for no reason, withholding water from the weary and bread from the hungry, and mistreating widows and orphans. So he made those as suggestions of maybe what Job's doing wrong. Acquisitions of practical atheism, 12 through 20. Eliphaz claims Job believes God is too high in the heavens to see or judge human affairs through the thick clouds. He cites the great flood as an example of what happens to the wicked who tell God to depart from us. So they think he thinks that Job thinks God is too high, doesn't see it. Call to repentance, 21 through 30. The speech ends with a famous appeal. Acquaint thou now thyself with him and be at peace. Eliphaz promised that if Job returns to the Almighty and treats his gold as dust, God will become his treasure and answer his prayers. So that's kind of a good advice here, although he didn't need to repent. Theological significance and irony. Commentators highlight the deep irony in Eliphaz's final words. In verse 30, he tells Job that God will deliver the guilty through the pureness of Job's hands. This inadvertently prophesies the book's ending in 42, where Job must intercede and pray for Eliphaz and his friend so God will forgive them. While Eliphaz's advice in the final verses is often quoted as sound spiritual counsel for reconciliation with God, scholars note that it was wrongfully applied to Job as his suffering was not the result of the secret sins of Eliphaz imagined. And this is 22:26. Surely then you will delight in the Almighty and lift up your face to God after he repents. 23. Job responds with the accusation of his friend Eliphaz by expressing a deep, agonizing desire to present his case directly before God. Feeling abandoned and misunderstood by his human companions, Job shifts his focus from defending himself to his friends to seeking a courtroom audience with the Almighty, whom he believes would ultimately vindicate him. So he's no longer looking at his friends, he's looking to the Lord. And this was the solution, and this is what his friends should have got him to do, rather than try to look at himself, getting them to look at him. Longing for divine hearing, 1 through 7. Job begins by acknowledging that his complaint is bitter because his suffering is even heavier than his groaning. He famously cries out, "Oh, that I knew where I might find him," in verse 3, establishing a wish to reach God's very seat or tribunal. Job is confident that if he could only state his case, God would use his great power to crush him, but not use his great power to crush him, but would instead give him strength and fair hearing. Good idea. He would be delivered forever from his judge because his conscience testified to his integrity. Hiddenness of God, 8 through 4:12. Despite his desire, Job laments that God remain elusive. He searches in every cardinal direction, east, west, north, and south, but cannot perceive or behold God's presence. Yet, in a powerful moment of faith, he declares, "But he knoweth the way that I take. When he hath tried me, I shall come forth as gold." Job asserted his faithfulness, noting that his feet have followed God's step and has treasured God's words more than my necessary food. Awe and terror before sovereignty, verses 13 through 17. The chapter ends with a shift towards the terrifying reality of God's absolute sovereignty. Job realizes that God is of one mind, his purposes are unchanged, and his power is irresistible. Terrified by presence, rather than finding comfort in God's plan, Job is terrified at his presence because he knows God will complete whatever has been appointed for him. So if it's bad, it's going to be bad. If it's good, it's going to be good. So he didn't know what to expect. The darkness, Job concludes by noting that God has made my heart soft, faint with fear. He is now silenced by the physical darkness of his trials, but by the overwhelming majesty and mysterious will of the Almighty. In 23:10, but he knows the way that I take, and when he has tried me, I shall come out as gold. So he's confident of that. 24, Job directly challenges the retribution theology held by his friends, which argued that God always and immediately punished the wicked while rewarding the righteous. Instead, Job presents a vivid and heartbreaking catalog of injustices, highlighting how evil men often thrive and exploit the vulnerable without any apparent divine intervention in their lives. Puzzle of Unpunished, 1 through 12. Job begins by asking God, does he not set specific terms, times, or days of judgment that the godly can see, and details various crimes that were serious offensive in his day. Theft and property injustice, men moved boundary stones to steal land and seize flocks violently. Expiration of the week. They take the only donkey belonging to an orphan or only ox of a widow as a pledge for debt, effectively stripping them of their livelihood. The abuse of laborers. Job describes laborers who produce wealth treading wine presses or making oil, yet they are forced to go hungry and thirsty while they work. Deeds done in darkness, 13 through 17. Job shifts his focus to those who rebel against the light, performing their crimes under the light of darkness. Murderers and thieves. These individuals rise at dawn to kill the poor and needy or dig through houses at night. Adulterers, they wait for twilight and disguise their faces, hoping no eye sees them. Fear of light. For these people, the morning is as terrifying as the shadow of death because it risks exposing their deeds. We notice today they have dark nightclubs, so I think it hasn't changed that much. The fate of the wicked, 18 through 25. The concluding verses of this chapter are debated among scholars. Some believe John is quoting his friend's belief, but refuting them, while others see it Job acknowledging that the wicked eventually die, but not necessarily in the way his friends suggested. Delayed judgment. Job admits the wicked are exalted for a little while, but then vanish just like everyone else, cut off like the heads of grain at the end of a full life. Normal decay, he observes that they pass away quietly, consumed by the grave, just as heat consumes snow, rather than being struck down by a sudden public judgment. Final challenge. Job ends by daring his friends to prove him wrong, confident that reality does not support their simplified view of divine justice. 24:24, they are exalted for a little while, but they are gone and brought low. They are taken out of the way just as all others. 25 is the shortest chapter in the book, containing only 6 verses. It records the third and final speech of Bildad the Shuhite. Most commentators view this brevity as a sign that the divine debate between Job and his 3 friends has run out of steam, as Bildad offers no new arguments, instead repeating earlier themes about God's majesty and man's impurity. Key themes of Bildad's speech: the majesty and dominion of God. Bildad emphasizes that the dominion and fear belong to God, who maintains order and peace in the high places, the heavens. He highlights God's infinite power by asking rhetorical questions about the numbers of his armies and the reach of his light, which shines on all creation. So he's saying God is really infinite. Human insignificance and sin. Bildad argues that it is impossible for mortal to be righteous or pure before a holy God. He uses a greater to lesser argument. If even the moon or stars are pure in God's sight, then man, whom he describes as maggots and a worm, certainly cannot be. Ending of the friends' discourse. This speech marks the last time any of Job's 3 original friends speak. Zophar does not give a third speech at all, signaling that his friends have exhausted their resources and failed to convince Job of their perspective. So that's good. Many modern commentaries bridge Bildad's question, how can a man be just with God, to the New Testament, noting that while Bildad had no solution, the gospel provides one through justification by faith in Jesus Christ. That's how we can be righteous before God. 25 verse 2, dominion and all belong to God. He established harmony of the heights of the heaven, which is true. So we're done with his 3 friends. 26, Job responds with a brief and recycled argument of his friend Bildad with stinging irony before delivering a majestic discourse on the incomprehensible power of God. This chapter marks a shift where Job moves from direct debate to a plain profession of his belief in God's sovereignty over all the nations of existence, the heavens and the earth and the underground, arguing that human knowledge only scratches the surface of God's majesty. Sarcastic rebuke 1 through 4. Job begins by ridiculing Bildad's unhelpful advice using heavy sarcasm. He asks, how have you helped him who is without power? He had worthless counsel. Job identifies himself as powerless and weak one, implying that Bildad's platitude have offered no practical help or new insight. That's what they should have been doing the whole time. Borrowed wisdom, he questions whose spirit spoke through Bildad, suggesting that his friends was merely parroting the theology of others, particularly Eliphaz. God's dominion over the unseen, 5 through 6. Job demonstrates that his own understanding of God far exceeds that of his friends by describing God's authority over the realm of the dead. The Rephaim, he notes that the dead tremble, the Rephaim or departed spirits beneath the water, showing that God's power reaches the deepest abyss. Sheol and Abaddon, these regions of destructions are naked and uncovered before God, meaning no part of the afterlife is hidden from his sight. Cosmic engineering and nature, 7 through 13. Job uses vivid poetic imagery to describe God's sustaining power in the physical world. The earth and the skies, he famously states that God hangs the earth on nothing. An unobserved, often highlighted as anticipating modern science understanding of the world's suspension in space. That's a scientific idea that he had. Meteorology, he describes God binding water in thick clouds without them bursting and veiling his throne or the moon with clouds. Chaos, subdued, reference to shattering Rahab, the proud one, and piercing the fleeting serpent. Use ancient mythological symbols to illustrate God's ultimate victory over forces of chaos and evil. And that's the forces of darkness are chaos and evil. The mere edges of his ways, Job concludes by emphasizing that all these wonders are only the fringes and outskirts of God's ways. This is just the tip of the iceberg. The faint whisper, what humanity perceives of God might be put in a whisper compared to the thunder of his power, which no one can truly understand. Humanity, this conclusion serves as a rebuke to the friends who claim to fully understand God's providential dealing with Job. This is a quote 26 verse 7. He stretcheth out the north over the empty space and hangeth the earth upon nothing. So this is an idea that they really didn't have before, and we know that is true today. In Job 27, Job delivers a final authoritative discourse, often called the parable, that reaffirms his personal integrity and provides a stark warning about the inevitable judgment of the wicked. Having silenced his three friends, Job uses his speech to separate his own suffering from the fate of his truly godless friends, whose apparent prosperity is ultimately hollow and fleeting. 1 through 6, Oath of Integrity. Job begins with a solemn oath, as God lives, to confirm that he's telling the absolute truth here. Defiance of accuser, he explicitly refused to justify his friends by admitting to sins he did not commit. To Job, lying about the guilt would be greater sin than the suffering he's currently enduring. Clear conscience, he declares that he will hold fast to his righteousness until he dies, and that his heart does not reproach him for any of his days. So he's got the right ideas. He's thinking the right way now. View of God, with acknowledgement of God as the source of his bitter soul, he appeals to him as the ultimate witness to his innocence. So he's looking to the Lord once again, and he's doing the right thing, talking with the Lord. Hopelessness of a hypocrite, 7 through 10. Job contrasts his own situation, that of a hypocrite or a godless person. No audience with God, he argues that when trouble comes, a hypocrite has no true hope because God will not hear their cry. Lack of delight, unlike Job, who continues to call on God despite his pain, a hypocrite does not delight in the Almighty and will not call him at all times. So you got to call on God in the good times, in the bad. And that's what Job is doing. Certain doom, 11 through 23, of the wicked. In the final section, Job agrees with his friend's general premise that the wicked are punished, but he corrects their timing and application. Futile success. A wicked man may heap up silver like dust, but the righteous will eventually wear his clothes, and innocent will divide his wealth. So, wicked might have it for a while, but we're going to have it for eternity. Fragile fountain. Their homes are flimsy as a mouse cocoon or a temporary watchman's booth. Sudden destruction using vivid imagery like the east wind. Job describes the wicked being swept away by terror and divine wrath, often meeting a sudden and unlamented end. 27 verse 11, I will instruct you in the power of God. I will not conceal the ways of the Almighty. And so he's telling his friend about the power of God. And this is really a very important thing, that God is infinite power and his ways are wise. Job 28, our last chapter, often called the Hymn to Wisdom, serves as a profound interlude in the book of Job. It pivots from intense debate between Job and his friends to a poetic mediation on the inaccessible nature of divine wisdom. Human integrity in mining, verses 1 through 11. Chapter begins by marveling at humans' persistence, the skill in extracting precious metals, silver, gold, iron, and copper from the dark, dangerous depths of the earth. Exploration. Humans put an end to darkness by carrying lamps into deep shafts to find hidden treasures, but the keenest eyes of bird or prey or the strongest beasts. Dominion, man's ability to overturn mountains and dams up streams to bring hidden things to light, represents the peak of human technological achievement. 12 through 22, inaccessibility of wisdom. Despite these triumphs, Job asks the central rhetorical question, but where can wisdom be found? That's the big question. Beyond earthly search, wisdom cannot be mined from the earth, found in the sea, or discovered in any living creature. Priceless value, no amount of gold, silver, onyx, or sapphires can purchase it. Its value is infinitely higher than the world's most precious shining bubbles. Testimony of death, even Abaddon and death, the realm of the death, only can be heard, a rumor of it, they do not possess it themselves. God is a sole source, 23 through 27. Job concludes that only God understands the way to wisdom because he is the creator who established the natural laws of the universe, measuring the winds, waters, and the path of the thunderbolt. So God's in control of everything. Omniscience, God sees everything under the whole earth, and because he's designed the world's complex order, he alone holds the blueprint of wisdom. Human definition of wisdom, verse 28. The chapter ends with a definitive instruction for humanity. Behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and depart from evil is understanding. Practical wisdom, since humans cannot understand God's hidden wisdom, the why behind suffering in the universe, our wisdom is found in reverence and moral integrity rather than exhaustive knowledge. The transition, the verse acts as a hinge, preparing the reader for God's eventual response in chapters 38 through 41, where he highlights the limits of human knowledge. So that's all we have for tonight in 28:28. And to man he said, behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to Depart from evil is understanding. And we're going to get more next time. And thank you for watching.